All right, welcome. As Sarah said, this is the first session of the semester, and this is really what I like to think of as a foundational element of starting a startup. What we call getting to product market fit, part one. As you might imagine, there's a part two. I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end of my talk here. But the real and I think more practical name of this talk is maybe something a little bit more engaging is, so I've got a great idea, now what? And judging by the way several of you raised your hands, or reluctantly raised your hands, you have something up here, but you haven't started to do much with it. And hopefully what this workshop will do is help you unleash those ideas and learn how to take and go from, or begin to go from an idea and turn that into a startup. All right, so in case you're not aware, there's an awesome history of entrepreneurship at NYU. And what you see here is a list of some of the startups founded by our students and faculty and our alumni over the last many years, actually. Some of the ones founded by our alumni go back, and there's a lot of big brand names that I'm sure you're very familiar with in there, from BuzzFeed to MTV, Southwest Airlines, Twitter, and others, and then lots that have been founded by your classmates and recent alumni and our faculty just over the last few years, like Brooklinen or even Etsy, which was just founded a decade ago, actually, by 3 students from Gallatin, and a lot of other great startups. So there's this great history of successful startups inside of NYU, and we're really proud of that. But startups are hard, and you may have heard anecdotal data that not all startups succeed, and it's actually much worse than not all, it's actually most. 75% of startups that raise venture capital actually fail, when we define failure by failing to return the money back to their investors. And if their investors are not getting at least their money back, it's pretty safe to say the business didn't succeed. The entrepreneurs didn't really accrue any wealth, and they're probably no longer in business. And that's quite sad and quite sobering. And so that gets people like me and my colleagues asking the question, why is it that so many startups fail? Which is something that, having worked in startups, founded my own startup and have been a venture capital investor for almost 20 years now, I've seen a lot and learned a lot of lessons, many the hard way. And there was a study done by our friends at CB Insights where they did a post-mortem of venture-backed startups and interviewed, I think it's close to 200 startup founders on why their startups failed. And this is how those founders self-reported. And I don't want to go through all these. I really want to focus on the top 2. And startups are hard, and there's no way to make every startup succeed. So let me burst that bubble. But we think there are ways to help increase the likelihood of success. But the comment I want to make on the first 2 is I would argue that very, very few startups fail because they ran out of cash. Because that implies that there's a shortage of money. And if you're in New York, or if you're in Silicon Valley, or Boston, or any startup hub, there is no shortage of money. Some would even argue there's actually too much money sloshing around the system right now. So when a startup can't raise additional money to sustain their operations, it's probably because there was something wrong with the business, where the investors didn't see that they could get a return on their investment and declined to invest further in that business. Okay? And so I really believe that when a startup runs out of cash, it actually relates more than likely to the first point, which is actually no market need, okay, or maybe insufficient market need. Okay? There wasn't enough traction. There wasn't enough customer engagement. There wasn't enough revenue. There weren't enough users. There weren't enough repeat customers. Okay? And that's a pretty sobering figure, that 42% of startups failed because of a lack of market need, meaning they built something that nobody wanted or not enough people wanted. And that, I believe, is something that is infinitely preventable. Okay, and the way that you do that is actually by understanding the needs of your users and customers before you actually waste the time and effort to actually build it. There's a great quote I love by Paul Graham, who's the founder of Y Combinator, one of the top startup accelerators in the world, called starting a startup is something you can only learn intrinsically by doing it. And what you need to learn is the needs of your own users. Okay, and that's not something that you can intuit or learn online. Okay, the answers to what are your users' needs and problems and preferences and priorities lie outside the building. And I mean that literally. Okay, they're not in your dorm, in your classroom, in wherever it is that you work. Okay, they're out in the market wherever your customers are roaming. And you may be smart. You may actually be the smartest person at NYU or in your industry or in your sector, but you're not smarter than the collective intelligence of your potential customers, buyers, and partners. And you cannot learn this simply by reading TechCrunch or blogs or even books on startups. In fact, a colleague of mine once said that learning to be an entrepreneur is like learning how to be a surgeon or a poker player. Okay, you can learn a little bit by a lecture and a video and a textbook, but very early on, you actually have to get on the table and start playing or cutting. Okay, hopefully if you're training to be a surgeon, you start with a cadaver. But even so, the learning needs to be experiential. Okay, and you need to be careful of quote-unquote experts, even venture capitalists. Okay, beware of the expert who tells you you should definitely do this. Okay, your customer should be your true north. Okay, and so you need to get out of the building and understand the needs of those customers, okay, before you actually finish designing or building the product. Okay, because though we talk a lot about failing fast and learning from failure, the most expensive way to fail is actually by finishing a product and shipping it and then finding out you built the wrong product, or that no one wanted it, or not enough people wanted it, or you couldn't acquire customers economically. So there's a lot of questions that you need to figure out. And this is not just about understanding their needs or how to make money. It's a whole host of questions, right? Not just who's your target customer, but who's going to be your first customer? What is it that they value, and why will they use or buy your product? How are you going to get, keep, and grow or acquire and retain customers and get a greater share of wallet from them over time, meaning extract more money from them to help sustain and grow your business? How are you going to sell your product? What's your revenue model? How do you actually make money? What kind of partnerships do you need? What are the key skills and assets and resources you need on your team? And what are the underlying unit economics? These are fundamental questions. And unfortunately, we see too many entrepreneurs they have an idea and they want to force their will onto the marketplace. And I can tell you that that rarely, if ever, works. Okay? So what great entrepreneurs have always done is identified a problem, validated it, tested it, iterated on it, and then built something collaboratively with input from their customers along the way. And this is a slightly different approach to what has been taught for years in business schools and even advocated by venture capitalists. Okay? It's something we now call evidence-based entrepreneurship. And I'll contrast that with faith-based entrepreneurship. Okay? It's not about believing and hoping and praying. Okay? It's about knowing. And there's a lot of things that you can know before you actually build anything. Okay, so in the olden days, we used to recommend and advise, in fact, if not require, that you start by writing out a 20 or 30 or 40-page business plan and creating an incredibly detailed financial model that projects, 5 years into the future in excruciating detail what's going to happen. Okay, well, that's crazy because that's like crystal ball kind of work. Okay, there's no way to project what's going to happen in the future for something that doesn't exist yet. Okay? There's another great quote from the founder of Intuit, Scott Campbell, who said, "For every one of our failures, we had spreadsheets that looked awesome." or to put it another way, from the great startup philosopher Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And that's a little bit what a startup is like, to the extent that, not that it's violent, but that you can't predict what's going to happen, okay, where that uppercut or right hook or jab are going to come from, okay, how your competitors are going to react, how your customers are going to react, how the regulatory environment might change, how the economy might change. Okay, so you need to be adaptive and agile in how you approach the marketplace. So we don't recommend that you start by writing a business plan or coming up with an incredibly detailed financial model. But that doesn't mean that you don't plan. Okay, we're talking about a different kind of planning, or the planning that comes before the plan. Okay, before he became president, Dwight Eisenhower once said, "In preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but that planning is indispensable." And that's exactly the kind of planning that we're talking about. Okay, so the way that we like to work with our students and faculty here at NYU is by using a tool called the Business Model Canvas. Who here has seen the Business Model Canvas before? Okay, wow, quite a few of you. All right, well, for those, if you bear with me for a moment, for those of you who haven't seen it before, the Business Model Canvas was a tool developed by Alex Osterwalder and Yves Pigneur as part of Alex's PhD work several years ago in Switzerland. And he came up with this as a way to concisely capture all the elements of a business model on one sheet of paper. Okay, because one of the problems with a business plan is elements of it are out of sight and out of mind. Okay, and so he came up with this, with these 9 boxes. Who are your target customers? What is it they value? How are you going to get, keep, and grow them as customers? How do you deliver your product or service to them? What are the key activities, resources, and partners that you need? How do you make money? And what is the cost structure of your business? Okay? But the goal is not just to fill out the canvas. Okay? The goal is to actually use the canvas as a scorecard of sorts and keep track of the different elements of your business model over time. Because at the very beginning, okay, you are starting out on your startup with a series of untested hypotheses. Okay, we call them hypotheses because you are in an institute of higher learning, and I believe you paid good money to be here, and I don't want to call them guesses. Okay, but that's essentially what we're talking about. You have a bunch of guesses or hypotheses about who are your customers and what it is that they value. Okay, and you'll also have a series of hypotheses for the other elements of the business model. And you may actually even have multiple hypotheses for some of them. Okay, and if you're in a business that serves multiple customers, you will definitely have multiple hypotheses mapped to those different customers. I'll give you an example that you're all familiar with, right? Everyone here uses Google more or less every day for search, right? Who are Google's 2 customers? Us and advertisers. That's exactly right. 2 different customers with 2 different value propositions, right? Advertisers want to get access to us in an economically efficient and highly targeted manner, and we want highly accurate, relevant search results. Okay, different value propositions for different customers. Okay, they have a revenue model for advertisers. They pay per click or pay per action. What do we pay? Nothing. We don't have, there is no revenue model for us. So that's what we call a multi-sided market. Question? We're not paying with, you're correct, but we're not paying with cash. Okay? Revenue, we normally are thinking of cash as the unit of measurement there. Okay, so you could see they also have different ways, in this case, of acquiring those customers, right? Google doesn't have salespeople calling on you, okay, but you can bet that they have salespeople that are calling on the big advertisers, maybe Coca-Cola or Budweiser or General Motors or someone like that. So The problem is, though, when you're getting started, even if you do a great job filling out your well-articulated and defined hypotheses for your business, more than half of your assumptions are wrong. And I don't say that to be flip, but actually that's based on data. Because actually we, in some of our programs and classes here, we use a digital tool called Launchpad Central. And for purposes of this conversation, just think of it as an electronic version of the business model canvas that teams use over the development of their startup. 60% of their initial hypotheses across thousands of teams have been invalidated. Okay, so it's likely that more than half of your assumptions are wrong. And the problem is you don't know which ones. So what we need is a systematic way of testing and identifying which of those are right or wrong, or validating or invalidating those assumptions. And that's where a technique that we call customer development comes in. And customer development is how you go about searching for your business model. Right? Big companies know who their customers are and know what they value, know how much they're willing to pay, et cetera. Okay? And can execute on that. Startups don't know those for fact. They have a series, as we said, of untested hypotheses. So they're searching for the answers to those questions. Does this make sense so far? Okay, so the process of customer development was first defined by Steve Blank in his book, 4 Steps to the Epiphany. Okay, but I'm going to give you a crash course in it right here. But the 4 steps were as follows: customer discovery, customer validation, customer creation, and company building. Okay? Most entrepreneurs like to start right here and go right into execution mode. Okay, starting in step 3, customer creation. They have an idea, they build it, and they try to get it in their customers' hands and then find out they're wrong. That's, as I said earlier, is the most expensive and time-consuming way. And even if you have the resources, okay, you may lose the patience of yourself or your partners or your spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend, okay, before you can recover and get it right. Okay, so in customer development, we start by testing our assumptions, testing those hypotheses about our customers' needs and problems, and use that to inform the creation of minimally viable products. And I'll talk more about MVPs towards the end of the talk. Okay? And we do that in a systematic way that we'll talk more about momentarily. Okay? Until we have a strong set of data that suggests that we know who our customers are and we know what they value. Okay? And then we can begin to use those MVPs, those minimally viable products, to get validation that people are actually interested in our product or solution. So to give you a quick example, okay, customer validation is the easier part. Okay, that's asking, if this is my startup, do you like my tasty beverage? Isn't it delicious? Don't you want it? Will you buy it? Etc. Okay, those are easy things to do. The harder thing for most entrepreneurs to do is actually the step before that, the customer discovery. Okay, and instead of offering my beverage, I say, when do you get thirsty? Why do you get thirsty? How often do you get thirsty? Where do you go when you get thirsty? What have you tried that you've liked? What have you tried that you didn't? Oh, really? Why didn't you like that? How much do you spend? All these kind of questions, so I understand my customers' needs, how they think about the problem, how they prioritize it, how much they spend on it, how much they worry about it, how much of a priority it is for them, before I even waste the time trying to develop my product or service. Okay, that conversation will inform my business much more than simply saying, yes, I like it, or I'll buy it. Okay? And so we do that in a repetitive fashion, making adjustments along the way. And those adjustments we call pivots. And this is probably the most overused and abused word in the startup world, but a pivot is not a restart. Pivot is not going from a beverage to a floor wax. Okay? A pivot is simply a change of one of the assumptions in your business model. Maybe changing who your initial target customer is, what your value proposition is. Changing your revenue model. Maybe instead of going from a sale, you're going to a subscription or to a freemium model or something like that. Okay? And we do that until we now have real validation that our customer likes our product, is using our product, is willing to pay for our product, and do it repeatedly, okay, so that we can begin to invest in customer creation. Okay? And now we're beginning to test how we can build demand. Okay, so it's kind of more of the sales and marketing side of the house, perhaps, and improving the efficiency of the way that we can acquire customers. Okay, if I'm selling my bottle of water here for $1, and it costs me $1.50 to acquire you as a customer, I've got a big problem. Okay, my sales and marketing alone costs more than the revenue I'm going to get from my product. Okay, maybe that's okay on day one, but that curve needs to go down very, very quickly. Okay, and then and only then, once we've identified our repeatable, scalable customer acquisition model, do we then begin to invest aggressively to drive growth. Okay, so again, start with customer discovery, test the problem, then test the solution. Okay? And the way we do that, and this is really the key part of my Part 2 talk, is by getting out of the building and talking to customers like I was talking about her search for thirst-quenching solutions a few moments ago. Okay? But it's not about simply asking customers what they want and trying to give this to them. Okay, this is what I call the curse of Steve Jobs. Okay, I love Steve. I worked at Apple, but I hear entrepreneurs saying that using this quote as an excuse for not needing to do customer research. You just need some kind of divine intervention and building it and shipping them because people don't know what they want. And that's true. People often don't know what they want. But it's not your customer's job to tell you what product to build. Okay, there's another great and I think overlooked quote that Steve also said, and that is that new ideas come from watching something, talking to people, experimenting, asking questions, and getting out of the office. And I couldn't agree more, and that's really what we're talking about. Now, this is something that you need to do yourself, because if you outsource this, this is what happens. You end up in a game of telephone. Everyone remember playing telephone when they were a little kid, right? And you say peas, and out the other end comes fleas. Okay? Sam Altman, who's also from Y Combinator, another quote I love, says, "Great founders never put anyone between themselves and their users." Okay, so this is not something that you outsource. It's not something you hire an intern or an MBA student to do if you're more technically inclined. The founders, whoever they are, whatever discipline they're in, need to own the customer in the very early days of your venture, because that's going to, as I said, going to be your true north going forward. All right, so diving a little deeper into customer development. Everyone remember the scientific method from high school or grade school, right? This is how it works. What we're going to do is apply the scientific method to business model development, right? So we already told you we're going to start with defining or formulating your hypotheses, right? And those hypotheses are going to be informed by your observations in the world. It's not always clear where our ideas come from. They're usually drawn from something we've seen or heard or experienced elsewhere in our life or in our work. And that's true here as well. Okay? And we use that to formulate hypotheses. We'll use the business model canvas for that, as I talked about. And then we will develop experiments to test those hypotheses rigorously. Okay? And we will do that in search for validation or invalidation of those results. If we're wrong, you might recall, we modify that hypothesis. Okay, and then maybe we have to redesign the experiment, or we can use the same experiment until we can establish a theory based on repeated validation of the results. Okay, that's the scientific method that we all learned when we were younger. Okay, and that's exactly what we're going to do in our startup. Okay, the only difference from this is that rather than modifying a hypothesis, or rehypothecating, as one of my colleagues likes to say, right, that's what we call a pivot. Simply one change in your set of hypotheses. Okay, so I'll say it again. First we test the problem, then we test the solution. Now, as I said, my part 2 talk is about how we actually put that into practice. How do you actually get out of the building? But before we do that, I want to take a deeper dive into the customer segment and value proposition segments of your business model, because that's your bedrock. Okay, and though visually the canvas doesn't show it that way, that is the foundational layer of your element. Those are the first areas where you should focus. Okay, because if your customer segment changes, that will have a ripple effect on the other elements of your business. Same as if you try to change out the foundation of your house, you'll have to rebuild everything else. Okay? So, starting with the value proposition, that addresses the question of what problem are you solving? And we do that by using the language of describing the benefits, not the features, not the capabilities of your product, but the benefits that come to your customer from using your product or service. Okay? The customer segment, maybe a little simpler, simply answers the question, who cares? Who has that problem? Okay? And why would they buy or use your product? As I mentioned earlier, that alignment between your customer segment and your value proposition and the very early stages we call problem-solution fit. Okay, where you have a deep understanding of the problem and you can conceive of a solution that would satisfy it. Okay, the difference between problem-solution fit and product-market fit is in product-market fit, you've actually put the product in their hands and they express satisfaction by using it or buying it or giving you feedback on it. Okay? Now, often someone will ask me, yeah, but what about Facebook? What problem did they solve? You guys have it so easy now. In all seriousness, it was hard, right, to walk up to a guy or girl and try to, ask them if they would go out, not even knowing that they already have a boyfriend or girlfriend, was terrifying. And try to do back channels to your friends, it was a real problem. I mean, I'm not saying Facebook has completely made your life a lot easier, but that was a real problem for college students. Okay? I don't think that much has changed in college since I was there. Okay? So that was when Mark had the epiphany and depth of understanding of a need that was previously unsatisfied. Okay, and he was actually able to code it up that night and test it out. And interesting fact about Facebook, they got 90% of the Harvard undergraduate population using it within 1 month. That's crazy. Okay, and then they steamrolled through the rest of the colleges, and you know the rest of the story. Okay, so as you're thinking about the value proposition, key questions that you need to understand are, what is the problem that you're solving? Particularly from the customer's point of view, okay? And why has that problem not been solved yet? Is it hard to solve? Has no one thought about it before? Okay, now, very often, someone has tried to solve your problem or the problem that your startup is solving before. You should go and learn from them. Actually, interestingly, Facebook was arguably one of the last social networks to come on the market. They were definitely not the first mover. Okay? That's okay. And how do they solve it today? Okay? Just because a technical solution similar to yours doesn't exist on the market doesn't mean your customers are not addressing it, right? In the case of Facebook, it was through back channeling and asking people, which was hard. It was at least emotionally and socially hard. Right? There's actually a startup that we work with that it was creating at the time a hemostatic gel. It's a fancy way of saying a gel that stops bleeding. And it did it really quickly. In 3 seconds, it could stop bleeding, which is pretty amazing. And when I asked them who their competitors were, which is really another way of saying, how do your customers solve it today? They said, oh, we don't have any. I'm like, really? So if I went to the medical center, there's just like people bleeding all over the place because there's no way to solve it, right? So how did their customers stop bleeding today? How do you stop bleeding? Band-Aid, gauze and pressure, right? Okay, what's the problem for that company with gauze and pressure? It's practically free, and it takes almost no training to do it. Okay, their product was not free, and it had to be refrigerated, right, et cetera, et cetera. And then they found out about regulatory, blah, blah, blah. So they ended up pivoting away from first aid, which was their first instinct, and then identifying, well, there's certain kinds of surgeries where you can't stop the bleeding with pressure. Okay, imagine if your gut was open and just pressing on your liver, it just moves. Okay? So they found the surgical market was ripe, and then they learned about the regulatory considerations there, and they pivoted to veterinary and surgery. And actually now that's their first point of entry, and they're actually doing well in that market. Okay? So who is delivering that solution? Okay, I kind of hit that point. But also, what level of improvement is required in efficacy, safety, cost? Right? If that hemostatic gel stopped bleeding in 10 minutes, not that helpful. 3 seconds, wow, that's huge. Okay, so understanding how much of an improvement is required to maybe make your users change their behavior, and using a new product or service is a change of behavior, is really important. Okay, and then how big is that problem? How many people have that problem? Okay, now I want to switch over to customers for a second. Okay, so who here is thinking about maybe a B2B or enterprise business as opposed to a consumer business? Anyone? Okay, a couple of you. Right? Maybe you're thinking that a hospital, in the case of the hemostatic gel, would be your business. Or maybe it's a media company. Maybe the government might be your customer. Or maybe a big Fortune 500 company, a mom and pop company, or maybe even a university, right? Those could all be your customer? Actually, no. None of those, I thought you'd like that. None of those are your customers. Okay? Because none of those companies buy anything. People in those organizations buy something. So when you think about your customer, I want you to think about the individual, not the organization. Okay? Is it a police officer? Is it a teacher? Right? Is it the CEO of the business? Is it the mayor of a town? Is it a doctor? And not just a doctor, is it a cardiologist or a podiatrist or a pediatrician, etc.? You get the point. Customers are people, and I want you to think about with great specificity the kind of customer that you're targeting. Okay, because if I ask you to go out and talk to 20 customers, you can't go and talk to 20 hospitals. Okay, but you could go and talk to 20, chief of nursing, or 20 purchasing agents, or 20 janitors, right? Okay, so it's really important that you get really specific and understand those people, who they are and why they buy, and where they buy, and how they buy. Do they have a budget set aside for that? And that's not just true for enterprise customers. Consumers set aside budgets as well for certain things. Okay, if not explicitly, we often do it implicitly, right? You see something, you say, that's too expensive. That means it's outside of your budget. So you've implicitly set budget, right? You also want to understand what matters to them, what motivates them, what are they trying to get done on their job, and we'll talk more about that in a second. And also understand who influences them, okay? To get to the point of understanding a day in the life of your customer, and this will become more important when you start moving into marketing and selling to them, to understand where and how you need to interject yourself into them in order to acquire them as a customer. Okay? So I talked about what matters to them and what motivates them. And one of the useful ways to think about this is something called the jobs to be done framework that Clayton Christensen popularized in his book, The Innovator's Dilemma. And jobs to be done is useful to think about is what is your potential customer trying to get done. And the canonical example of this is that your customer, using a drill as an example, is that your customer doesn't want to buy a 1/4-inch drill. Okay, they actually are trying to create a 1/4-inch hole. Okay, or maybe to hang a picture or install a shelf. Understanding that context is important because a colleague of mine has a pink drill that her parents bought for her when she was a freshman in college 15 years ago. Okay, and she's used that drill moving in and out of college 4 times and 2 apartments and then grad school and 3 apartments since, assembling, disassembling furniture, hanging pictures, et cetera, et cetera. And it worked really well for her. It's proven to be really reliable. But would this guy use a pretty pink drill? Probably not, even though maybe functionally it could do the job for him. Okay, and that's the trap, right, is that we only think about the functional dimensions of the job our customer is trying to get done. And that is important. Okay, I'm not trying to tell you that it's not important. It's just it's not the only thing. Okay, so what are the speeds and feeds and capabilities of our product? What must it do functionally, mechanically, et cetera? Right, but what are the emotional and social jobs that your customer needs to get done? Okay, so in this case, our construction worker needs the confidence that his job can, that he can get the job done, that his product, the drill is going to be reliable, or that if it fails, that it'll be quick and easy to get it fixed so he can continue getting his work done. And this is a true story, actually, that a power tool manufacturer named Hilti, which was an also-ran in the market, added a 4-hour on-site replacement guarantee. If you're building a building and your tool fails, they will get you a new one within 4 hours. Okay? Without changing their product. So the functional capabilities of the product stayed the same. It added great emotional capabilities to their product, and Hilti's market share ascended as a result of that. Also, there are social jobs to be done. Okay, people want to show up. Like Mike would not use that pretty pink drill because it doesn't convey that he's serious about his job. Okay, and this is actually really true in an enterprise or B2B context. Okay, doctors choose which tools they use sometimes because they want to convey they're using the latest and greatest to their patients or maybe even to their colleagues. Okay, we all make personal decisions every day in what we buy, what we wear, and what we drive that are heavily skewed towards the emotional and social considerations, right? Anything in my closet will keep me warm and not naked, okay? But some clothes make me feel a certain way. Okay? I like to wear Patagonia because I feel like I'm on the top of Kilimanjaro every time I put it on. Okay? Or maybe I wear something that makes me look more professional or more attractive to other folks. Okay? Think about cars, right? Any car can get you from A to B. Okay? But some cars make us feel better about ourselves. Some cars make us feel safer. Some cars convey things to other people, right? Muscle cars or sports cars, right? You don't really need a sports car unless you're really racing. Okay, so that, and even a Tesla, right? It's not saving you money. It's not necessarily even saving energy. But it is saying something about you or making you feel a certain way. All right, so let's play a quick game. All right, so I'm going to display a variety of functional emotional, and social jobs. And as soon as you can, just shout out what company, product, or service you think I'm talking about. Okay? So I want the convenience of shopping online. I want to be able to decide how much I will pay for a product. I want an easy way to sell things I no longer need. eBay, good job. I want an efficient way to share my pictures with all my friends and family. I want to feel in the know about things happening in my social circles. I want a way to reconnect with friends I haven't talked to in a while. I want to feel confident when having a close conversation. I want my mouth to feel refreshed. I want to kill the germs that cause bad breath, Listerine. I want to show that I have the latest gadget. I want to be able to get information easily when on the go. I want to kill small snippets of time productively. iPhone. I want to feel like I'm buying the best for my family. I want to be socially conscious. I want access to high-quality grocery products, Whole Foods. Okay, so you guys nailed all of these, notwithstanding Snapchat and board games. And in many cases, you did it before I actually told you what it did. Okay, so think about that. Now, that's good marketing and branding as well, but it's that you understand the emotional and social jobs that these products or services do for you, as well as you understand the functional jobs that they do for you. And in order to do this well, okay, you need to put yourself in your customer's shoes, okay, figuratively or literally, and understand them the way that you need. Okay, I want to go back to this term customers, okay, because I've been talking about this, and I'll be honest, a little sloppy in how I've been using this definition. Okay? Now, we already said customers are people, right? But different customer segments have different customer types. Okay, I'll explain what I mean by that. Okay? Now, when most of you, if I asked you who your customer is, you'd show me this guy, your user. Okay? And your user is your customer, but it's not your only customer. Okay? Because often, your user is not the same person as the economic buyer. Okay, one person might be using it while another person is actually paying for it. Okay, and in an enterprise context, that is often true. Okay, but even in a consumer context, it is as well, because you can imagine with Homer and Bart. But it's even more complex than that. If you'll pardon the pun, there's a whole cast of characters that are your customers. Okay, and if Bart wants to buy a new comic book, okay, I can never remember. What's this guy's name? That's not Milhouse. It's, whatever his name is, okay? Ralph. Is it Ralph? I don't know. Ralph. Let's go with Ralph, okay? Ralph might influence Bart because he's big into comic books and they're good friends and so on. But we know that when Bart goes to the comic book store, comic book guy, and that is his name, I looked that up, comic book guy is actually the recommender, right? The salesperson in the store. Okay? Now we all know in The Simpsons, Marge wears the pants in the family, and she's actually the decision maker. Even though Marge is the homemaker, right? Homer's the one who brings home the bucks from the nuclear plant, right? So he's technically the economic buyer. But don't forget about little Lisa. Now, why might Lisa be the saboteur? Right? Maybe they're vying for the same few dollars, that discretionary dollars that the family has. Or maybe if you're like me, I was the big brother of three. I didn't have that when I was their age. They don't need that, right? So I was the saboteur to my little brothers. I'm seeing a lot of grins here. I sense you guys did that too. So all of these people may be your customers. And in an enterprise context, this is definitely true, okay? Like I may be the decision maker for my unit here, for the Entrepreneurial Institute and Leslie eLab of what hardware equipment we buy. Okay? But the economic buyer is actually our finance team. Okay? The recommender might be the IT organization that puts certain equipment on an approved list. Right? My whole team are all the users. Maybe there's a Windows person on my team who's our saboteur, because we're all Mac users, but you get the point. Okay? So all of these people are your customers, and you need to understand each one of them, not just your user, because all of them are in between you and getting your product or service into Bart's hands. Okay? So when I use the term customer, I'm really thinking of what is that ecosystem of people, that cast of characters, that you need to understand, satisfy, and appeal to in order to get them to buy or use your product. Everyone with me? Okay. Now, once you understand that, you also need to understand who's going to be your initial target customer. Okay, so just like Facebook, their very first customers were not college students, but actually Harvard students. That sounds like a cruddy little market. And it was by itself. But they crushed that market, and then they expanded to Columbia, Yale, and Stanford, and then the rest of the Ivy League, and then the rest of four-year colleges, and then junior colleges, and then high school students. And you know the rest of the story. Today, your grandmother, much to your chagrin, is using Facebook. Okay? You similarly need to understand who is going to be your initial target customer. Who are going to be those enthusiasts or early adopters? Because I assure you, if Facebook or any company tried to appeal to the mainstream market, they would fail. Okay? Your product does not have the broad appeal, contrary to what you might think. You don't have the sales and marketing team or budget to appeal to the mainstream market, okay, meaning advertising on TV, for example. Okay, you can't afford to do that as a startup. But also, the mainstream market is not homogeneous. And if you've ever noticed, to the extent you still watch television, that TV ads vary by the type of show they're on sometimes. You know, the Apple ads, for example, that are on during Trevor Noah's The Daily Show or during Adult Swim are very different than the ones they show on the Sunday morning news shows, okay, or the ones that are shown on the evening news, because they're targeting different audiences, even though that is collectively referred to as the mainstream market. So the mainstream market is actually comprised of a lot of sub-markets. Okay, you got to figure out which one of those sub-markets is going to be your point of entry, your beachhead. Okay? And for Facebook, that was Harvard and the Ivy League students, perhaps. Okay, when Apple first came out with its first computer called the Apple I in the 70s, okay, and it literally was just a logic board in a box without a power supply, without any software, without a keyboard or video display, that appealed to a very narrow niche, okay, of hobbyists or geeks at the time. And they were measured in the hundreds, maybe thousands across the world in the mid-70s. Okay? By the time they introduced the Apple II, 3 or 4 years later, it appealed to a broader, larger market. The Macintosh to a broader, larger market still. And today, it definitely appeals to the mainstream market. Another example. Who wants a combined phone, internet, browsing, and mail device that doesn't support copy and paste, doesn't have a physical keyboard, gasp, no front-facing camera, only 2G data speeds, no support for corporate email, no third-party apps, and it only works with one carrier? Okay? That was, 10 years ago, the first iPhone. And the truth was, a lot of people didn't want it. Okay, though it might seem like the iPhone was an overnight success, it wasn't. In fact, does this chart look familiar? Okay? That's iPhone sales up until a couple of years ago. Okay? And it followed that same curve that I showed you a few moments ago. Right? So they were the enthusiasts. And actually, that was my wife. My wife stood in line on June 7th, what year was that? 2007, and waited 3 hours to get that iPhone. Okay? I actually waited a year. So I was a visionary. She was an enthusiast, but I was a visionary. I'm fine with that. Okay, and I got the iPhone 3G once it had 3G data speeds, and I think they fixed copy and paste. Okay, and then the App Store came along, and that kind of changed everything. Okay, and you kind of know the rest of that story. Though that people, there's a lot of talk in the industry about their iPhone sales plateauing. We'll see what this new launch that they just did can do for them. So my point is the following. In fact, I have two. Okay, as a startup, I kind of said this already, but you're not capable of serving the mainstream market with your half-baked product, your small staff, and your non-existent sales and marketing budget. And I don't mean that to be critical of your product or service as you conceive it today, but every startup looks back in 3 to 5 years and they cannot believe that they shipped that and that anybody wanted it. But none of those companies could have built the product that they built in year 5 in year 1. Okay, think about if Facebook tried to build in a Harvard dorm what Facebook is today. They never would have shipped it. Okay, so another way of saying this is what Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, is famous for saying. He goes, if you're not embarrassed by your first version of your product, you ship too late. That's not to say to ship crap. Okay, but don't let perfection be the enemy of the good is maybe another way to put it. My second point related to that is that there's no point in building the features for when you're going to have 1 million users. Okay, optimize your product for the immediate stage of growth and that initial target customer that is before you. Okay, Dharmesh Shah, the founder of HubSpot, said, even though you target just those few potential customers today, there's no law that says you're limited to those customers for eternity. So find that beachhead and own it. And if you've ever heard Peter Thiel talk about monopolies, that's exactly what he means. He doesn't mean, have a worldwide monopoly on day one, but find that small market, monopolize it, and expand from there. Okay? So if you think you're now at problem, solution, fix, you figured out what the pain point is that you're solving and who you're selling to, you're ready to start building and selling, right? Not so fast. Okay? We only talked about 2 boxes on the business model canvas, and I'm not going to spend the time to go through the other elements of that right now. We can point you at other resources about that. But as I said, the customer segment and value proposition are your foundational elements. That's your bedrock, okay? Even though you can't really have a valid business model until you've fully vetted the entirety of your business model canvas. But if you do get to that notion of problem, solution, fit, that should begin to inform how you're going to solve the problem, okay? And that's the second part of this, or third part, is the minimum viable product. And this is also, along with pivoting, maybe the second least understood dimension of startups these days. The minimum viable product is not a crappy first version of your product. Okay, the minimum viable product, and maybe it is unfortunately named, is whatever you can do to help start the process of learning as quickly and cheaply as possible. So it depends what it is that you need to or want to learn. Okay, and that your customer wants to buy your product or service is actually probably too high level of something to focus on. I'll give you, we'll talk more about that. So the MVP is that smallest feature set that gets you learning, feedback, failure, maybe even orders. But again, as I'll show you, you don't have to build a product to test for that. And it should be incremental and it should be iterative. Okay, it's not, you don't have an MVP. You create MVPs, okay? But your MVP is not necessarily a prototype. It is not necessarily a deployable version of your product with fewer features. It is what enables you to test a hypothesis. It could be a drawing, it could be a slide, it could be a wireframe, it could be a clickable workflow, it could be something that your customers experience. Okay, and I'll give you a couple of examples. What do you think this could be an MVP for? A doorstop? I like that. What else? Maybe a cell phone. Okay, that's the closest so far. I don't know who's old enough to remember this, but there was something in the early 90s called the Palm Pilot. This was the first PDA, or Professional Digital Assistant. This was the precursor to the smartphone. It's the smartphone without the phone. Okay, and Jeff Hawkins, who's one of the founders of the company, created this as an MVP. What do you think he was trying to test? The size. What else? Yes, right? So you got to remember, this is before the cell phone, or at least before cell phones were mainstream. Back then, guys at least only carried one thing in their pocket, and that was a wallet. Would people carry two things? It's actually a reasonable question. Would they put it behind their wallet? Would they put it in a different one? How did it feel? And so Jeff got this wooden block and put it in his pocket and walked around, and then periodically we'd go, oh, what's that phone number? And we'd just imagine what that experience was like. Before he wired anything or wrote any software, did that for a while, and then created this mock-up. I don't even want to call this a prototype because this is made with paper mache. Okay, and that stylus, that was maybe the first stylus, is actually a whittled down chopstick. Okay, and he was then able to test the form factor. Okay, what was it like taking a stylus in and out? And actually created paper versions of what he thought the interface should look like and was able to get feedback on that. In fact, I don't have a picture of it, but they used Post-it notes to peel away and show changes in state. If you tap here, that's what happens. Okay? Got a lot of feedback on that, and then began the process of actually building the product from scratch. Okay, another example, Medtronic was working with some doctors to try to figure out how to use this, what should the form factor be of this new device. And they had a bunch of stuff sitting on a conference room table, and they were talking to doctors and understanding how they do these certain kinds of surgeries and how this new technology might be used in surgery. And one of the doctors said, well, it would be great if it looked something like this. And they ended up creating that. Okay? Again, all of these quick, dirty, cheap, maximize learning with as little effort as possible. Okay? Here's another example. I know this is a little hard to see, but this is the search results in Google, right? And you guys know the results on the very top that are usually colored, and on the right side there are ads. Okay, Google's pretty clear about that. Okay, you could buy Google AdWords and create a landing page or a dummy website for a product to test how people might search for your product or service. And in this case, if I want to create a new shaver and test how people might discover me, how much is it going to cost me to get them to my website, I could do all of that before I ever even created my product. Okay, and in fact, you could also A/B test different versions with different copy or different button placements or different photos, different colors, different value propositions, different pricing. Okay, and then you could also begin to model what percentage of customers who come to your site might actually order. Right? So you say, click here for products and pricing. And then you say, click here to buy. And then maybe you put up a page that says, sorry, we're out of stock. But now you know that you're starting to understand what your marketing funnel is going to look like. For every 1,000 people I get to my web page, okay, 800 of them bounce away, 200 of them click for more info, and 10 of those place an order. And that ad cost me $50 to get those 1,000 people. Okay, well, now I know it's $5 to acquire each one of those customers who were intending to order. Now, maybe some portion of them would then fall away, but you now actually have real data. Okay, and if you're worried about soiling your brand, then make up another name. Companies do this all the time. And by the way, even if you use your brand, you might expose yourself to 1,000 people in this process. There's 300 million people in the country. You're going to be fine. Okay? So the goal of creating an MVP is to answer questions and generate new ones. Actually, let me give you another example of an MVP. Everyone here use Zappos? Right? Buy shoes online. It's now part of Amazon. When Tony Hsieh and his co-founders were starting Zappos, they had one big challenge, and that's that they had to buy inventory, right? It's expensive. And if they bought the wrong inventory, they could be their death knell. Okay, if they, maybe they were going after women's shoes and they bought open-toed, and open-toed were out of fashion that season, or whatever it is. They bought the wrong size, the wrong color. So what they did is they created a quick and dirty website, scraped photos of shoes off other websites, and whenever someone placed an order, they ran out to a shoe store and bought the shoes and then would ship them to you at a loss. But they did that a certain number of times, I don't know, maybe 1,000 times, let's say. Maybe they lost $20 per shoe. That's a $20,000 experiment where they learned millions of dollars worth of data. Okay, they now learned the distribution of men versus women, styles, colors, sizes, and their return rate. How many people actually were calling? Okay, before they actually built the entire back end of the website and before they actually bought a warehouse and inventory. And that put them in a much better position to actually, I'm sure, raise funds as well. So again, to help you, so that's you could think of that, that's a customer experience. That's what we would call a Wizard of Oz test, right? Ignore the man behind the green curtain, okay? To answer questions and generate new ones, and to validate and also invalidating your assumptions. Invalidation is good. That means you don't have to do that thing anymore. Okay, and you can start to focus your efforts on what you should be doing or creating the next test. It's also a good way to compare alternatives, as I talked about, A/B testing, or trying two different sizes or styles or whatever. Okay, and help you fail early and fail cheaply. And also to help you visualize your ideas and share them with others, okay? With others on your team, certainly with your customers, potentially even investors. Okay, so I tell you all of this with the hope of helping you make your startup suck less. Okay? That it's not about going into stealth mode, disappearing, and then coming out with a big launch. Okay, even though it seems that that's what companies do, the good ones, okay, even Apple are doing a ton of customer research. They're just doing it out of plain sight. Okay? And they're getting that feedback and developing that insight before they build and launch their product, so that they can actually create products that customers actually want. Not that they hope that they want, but that they know that they want. And as an investor, I can tell you that I know when an entrepreneur has been engaging with the market, because they have a very different language that they use. They talk about their customers, even if they haven't shipped their product yet. Okay? They talk about them because they know them. They understand them. They will tell you anecdotes about them. And they don't say we think or we believe. They use the language of knowing. And you can't really fake that. Okay? And the real goal of this is not just to actually ship something that customers want, but to do it as quickly and cheaply as possible. Okay, and I haven't really used this term, but this is the lean startup technique, the lean startup methodology. And it's not about necessarily saving money, but it is about minimizing waste. And your most precious resource is your time in the early days of your startup. And you can't afford to waste it. So focus on the things that matter and figure out the things about your business that are wrong as quickly as you can so you can get to what's right. And we do that through experimentation, customer feedback, and that iterative design process we talked a little bit about. Okay? So I hope this has been helpful. What I'd like to do now is to actually switch gears and actually put you guys to work a little bit. And I'm glad most of you actually raised your hands, that you have some idea. For those of you who don't have an idea that you're working on, I'd like you to make one up just for in your own head, or pick an existing company or product that you know about, maybe a startup, so it's not Coca-Cola, it's not Apple, it's not Budweiser. Okay, and we're going to do a few exercises using some cheat sheets that'll help you think through this. Okay, so I'm not sure I have enough of these for everybody. And I'm going to say thank you to everyone who's watching. And I hope this has been really helpful. And hope to see you at the Leslie eLab soon.